There was a particular hush that fell upon Renford Hall whenever the evening trains began their slow, melancholy approach towards the village station. The house, perched upon a mild rise overlooking the rolling winter fields, seemed to listen for them, as though the passing thunder of wheels might carry gossip from London or perhaps take away a secret before anyone noticed its presence. On this evening the hush was deeper, almost ceremonial. Lady Honoria Renford was hosting one of her carefully curated literary evenings, an affair composed of the sort of people who considered themselves above self-promotion, but nevertheless desired to be admired. Renford Hall was ideally suited to such gatherings, all polished oak, pale velvet curtains, and a reticent grandeur that seemed to apologize for existing at all. A fire murmured discreetly in the long drawing-room. Guests stood about like well-trained chess pieces. The novelist Edmund Lorimer leaning on the marble mantel. Miss Portia Vale, playwright and wearer of aggressively delicate elbow gloves, seated on a love seat. Colonel Arthur Pembroke, stiff as a ceremonial standard, examining the spines of books he likely never intended to read. And Lady Honoria herself, drifting between her guests with the gentle self-satisfaction of a swan gliding over a lake. But the quiet center of gravity lay near the French doors, where two figures stood slightly apart from the others. Lionel Harcourt, railway executive, amateur pianist, and professional thorn in polite society's side, was speaking in his characteristic half-murmur, half-snare. Beside him stood his wife, Cressida Harcourt, a woman of such restrained beauty that she seemed unaware of it herself. Her hands were folded neatly before her, but her eyes were fixed on her husband with an apprehension that suggested she anticipated his every indiscretion before he committed it. "Darling, you really mustn't antagonize Edmund," she murmured quietly as Harcourt chuckled into his sherry. "He has only just arrived." "My dear," Harcourt responded, "Lorimer is antagonized by the mere act of drawing breath. If I refrain from providing material, he'll invent it." Lorimer, overhearing this with the faintest stiffening of his shoulders, pretended not to. Portia Vale watched the exchange with cat-like interest. Pembroke continued his inspection of the bookcase as though waiting for some volume to salute him. At precisely 9 o'clock, a footman announced the arrival of the final guest, Beatrice Darkling, the painter whose recent exhibition had caused a ripple of fashionable confusion. Was it genius or merely cleverness wrapped in blue-gray oils? Her entrance silenced the room in that subtle way particular to people who give the impression of holding a mirror up to everyone else's insecurities. Lady Honoria glided forward. "My dear Beatrice, so glad you could come. I was just saying to Portia that your newest portrait has quite unsettled me." Beatrice Darkling smiled, though the expression barely reached her eyes. A painting that unsettles is at least a painting that is remembered. Her gaze drifted, almost lazily, to Lionel Harcourt. Something sharpened in her expression, a flicker swiftly suppressed. Cressida Harcourt, seeing it, lowered her eyes as though to avoid witnessing the thought behind the moment. Lady Honoria, with well-practiced ceremony, signaled that conversation might resume. A soft murmur filled the air. Someone asked about the 9:45 train from London, rumored to be running late due to fog near Henley, and Colonel Pembroke launched into a minor lecture about the inefficiencies of modern rail administration. Lionel Harcourt, who oversaw several of the railway's new regional lines, allowed the colonel's complaints to wash over him with a languid amusement that only irritated the colonel further. But beneath the civil talk, something trembled, an unspoken discord, like a piano tuned a fraction too sharp. It lay in glances not quite completed, sentences begun then abandoned, the deliberate avoidance of certain topics. Even Alleyn, had he been present, would have felt it like a shift in atmospheric pressure. For the company, though elegant in manner, was composed of individuals with past entanglements, unspoken debts, and the sort of grievances that, in society, are considered impolite to resolve. At 9:30, Lady Honoria called them towards the music room for a short performance by Cressida Harcourt. Cressida played the piano with a melancholy grace that made one think of winter mornings and half-forgotten letters. As she played, Lionel stood behind her with a faint, inscrutable smile. His gaze kept drifting towards Beatrice Darkling. Beatrice stared at the sheet music, though she wasn't reading it. When the last note faded, the silence felt heavy rather than reverent. "A lovely interpretation," Beatrice murmured. Lionel gave a soft laugh. "Interpretation, indeed." Cressida closed the piano softly. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, faint and distant, the whistle of the approaching 9:45 train drifted across the dark fields, lonely, punctual, and, to two people in the room, faintly ominous. The cracks in the evening had begun. The last echoes of the 9:45 whistle had hardly faded when the gathering began to disperse into small conversational clusters, each person selecting companions according to affinity or convenience. Lady Honoria encouraged her guests toward the dining room, where a modest supper awaited. Cold quail, a delicate consommé, and a lemon syllabub so light that one felt it might drift away if not attended to. Cressida Harcourt lingered behind the others. She stood by the tall window overlooking the lawns, her fingers resting lightly on the cool glass. The night beyond was a mass of misted shadows, blurring hedge, field, and sky into a single grey veil. Somewhere along the distant ridge, she could still hear the faint rumble of the passing train as it wound its way beyond the village. Lionel approached her with a glass of wine and a carefully performed casualness. "You're looking pale, Cressida," he murmured. "Even for you." She accepted the glass without quite meeting his eye. "It's the fog, I expect. One feels as though the world were shrinking." "Or expanding," Lionel suggested idly. "Fog is democratic. It obscures us all equally." He glanced towards the dining room, noting who had paired with whom. "Come along. Honoria dislikes food being kept waiting. It implies indecision." "I'll join you in a moment," Cressida said softly. Lionel studied her for a beat too long, then moved away, his step light and self-assured. As he passed through the doorway, his eyes brushed briefly over Beatrice Darkling's. Something silent and electric passed between them, a look with the heft of a long conversation. Cressida saw it, though she pretended not to. In the dining room, the atmosphere, though polite, carried the faint stiffness of people who wished to say far more than they dared. Lorimer had taken his place beside Portia Vale, who was recounting a story from the theatre with elaborate hand gestures that caught the candlelight like punctuation marks. Colonel Pembroke sat opposite Lady Honoria, offering her a dry commentary on the fog's interference with military operations in his day, none of it quite relevant, but she nodded with the patience of a practiced hostess. The footmen served quietly, moving like shadows. It was not until the syllabub arrived that Lady Honoria noticed the absence. "My dear, where is Cressida?" she asked Lionel with a faint frown. Lionel did not look up from his plate. Taking a moment, the performance tired her. Beatrice Darkling lifted her eyes very slightly at this, but said nothing. Honoria's frown deepened, but she let the matter rest. Still, a certain unease settled over the table, as though the room had suddenly grown too large for the people within it. When supper was finished, the guests drifted back toward the drawing room. The fire had fallen to a quiet glow. A footman was sent to fetch Cressida, but he returned a moment later with a puzzled expression. "Begging your pardon, my lady," he said to Honoria, "but Mrs. Harcourt isn't in the music room." "Not in the music room," Lionel repeated, a faint theatrical amusement coloring his voice. "Perhaps she went upstairs." But Lady Honoria, who understood the rhythm of her household like a conductor reading a score, shook her head. She would not wander. Not tonight. The party paused in that peculiar suspended stillness that only English society can manage. No alarm, merely a tension in the air, like the moment before a word is chosen. "Check the terrace," Honoria murmured. She looked unwell earlier. Two of the footmen moved swiftly. There, steps faded down the long corridor, then out into the open night. The guests waited, murmuring half-sentences that dissolved before becoming questions. Beatrice Darkling had moved to the hearth, arms crossed lightly, her gaze fixed on nothing. Through the windows, the fog pressed close against the glass. The garden lamps cast blurred halos of light onto the terrace stones. Then came the shift, the almost imperceptible sound of running steps, too hurried for decorum. One footman appeared in the doorway, face pale. "My lady," Honoria turned sharply. Even Lionel straightened. "It's Mrs. Harcourt," the footman stammered. "On the terrace. She's fallen." The last word landed like a cold draft across the room. Honoria rose at once, composure a fragile mask. The guests followed in a strange procession. Lionel first, his expression unreadable. Beatrice just behind him, though her hands trembled once at her sides. Lorimer, Portia, and Pembroke close behind. The terrace was slick with mist. Its stone balustrade glistened faintly. Cressida Harcourt lay near the base of the steps, one arm tucked oddly beneath her, her head turned toward the darkness of the lawn. No sign of struggle, no cry, no chaos, only stillness. Her pale evening gown seemed almost luminous in the haze. Lionel knelt beside her, touching her wrist. His hand remained there for a long moment. Too long. Then he rose slowly. "She's gone." There was no scream, no dramatic wail, only the soft, stunned exhale of Lady Honoria and the shifting of fog across the stones. The guests could not have said what they felt, for the moment stole even vocabulary, but something in the air, fragile and cold as the mist, suggested that this death was not a simple fall, not an accident, not quite peaceful. A quiet horror, elegant and chilling in its restraint, had settled upon Renford Hall. Inspector Roderick Alleyn arrived at Renford Hall shortly after midnight, brought from London by a discreet call from the local constable who, having little taste for questions involving polished drawing rooms and polished people, summoned him with evident relief. The fog had thickened to a dense shroud by the time Alleyn stepped from the motor. The lamps along the gravel drive cast blurred cones of light, which the mist absorbed as quietly as a theatre curtain swallowing a spotlight. Renford Hall loomed in a softened silhouette, its stone facade ghostly beneath the drifting veil. A footman met him with the apologetic stiffness of a man who wished he were invisible. "If you'll come this way, sir. Lady Honoria is waiting in the morning room." Alleyn nodded. "Has anything been moved?" "No, sir. Mr. Harcourt insisted nothing be touched." "I see." As Alleyn followed him through the long corridor, the hall's hush struck him immediately, too deliberate, too carefully maintained. These were the silences of people who wished to be seen as composed, yet whose composure was wearing thin at the edges. Lady Honoria rose when he entered. Her poise, though admirable, carried the faint tremor of someone steeling herself to remain hostess when the script called for far more. "Inspector Alleyn, thank you for coming at this late hour." Alleyn gave her a courteous bow. "My duty, Lady Honoria. I understand there has been a fall." She closed her eyes briefly, the gesture both weary and restrained. "Yes." Poor Cressida Harcourt. She slipped on the terrace steps. "Lionel." She paused, gathering herself. Her husband found her. The fog was dreadful. Alleyn observed her carefully. The words were correct, the sentiment moderately convincing, but the slightest hesitation lingered, enough to suggest that the explanation, while offered, was not entirely believed. "May I see the terrace?" "Of course. Lionel is there now." He followed her through the house to the glass doors opening onto the terrace. From within, the lamps gave the fog an amber glow. Outside, the mist curled like soft, moving fabric. Lionel Harcourt stood alone near the steps, his back to them, hands clasped loosely behind him. He turned at the sound of their approach. "Inspector, you might as well see for yourself. A wretched business." Alleyn stepped out onto the damp stone. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Harcourt." Lionel inclined his head, neither grateful nor resentful, but somehow detached, as though the words were being addressed to a man adjacent to him. Cressida's body still lay where they had found her, a small white shape beneath the drifting fog, carefully guarded by a constable who hovered nearby with the solemn awkwardness of a man out of place. Alleyn crouched beside the body, his movements unhurried. He examined Cressida's hands first, then the angle of her head, the position of her feet. Her gown was slightly damp at the hem, but otherwise undisturbed. "Who first saw her?" Alleyn asked quietly. "One of the footmen," Lionel replied. "I followed him out. She must have stepped out for air and lost her footing. These stones are treacherous at night." Alleyn laid the back of his gloved hand lightly against the cold stone of the steps. "Treacherous, yes, but not unusually so." He glanced at the balustrade. No chips, no broken stone, no sign of a hand had clutched at it. "It was very foggy," Lionel added. "So I see." He rose, brushing his knee lightly. "Who last spoke with Mrs. Harcourt?" Lionel hesitated, almost imperceptibly. "I did, before supper." "Was she distressed?" "If she was, she hid it well. Cressida was reserved." Lady Honoria, who had lingered near the doorway, murmured. She was pale before she left the room. Alleyn nodded thoughtfully. "And no one else saw her leave?" "No," Lionel said. "She must have slipped out quietly." The fog shifted around them like a living presence. Alleyn stood, still for a moment, absorbing the quiet weight of the scene. The terrace, despite the mist, felt oddly static, like a tableau waiting for interpretation. "Would you mind gathering everyone in the drawing room?" he asked Lady Honoria. "I will speak with them briefly. Nothing formal, just to understand the evening." Honoria inclined her head and departed, grateful perhaps to be given direction. Lionel remained. "Is it necessary to trouble them tonight? They're shaken." Alleyn offered a gentle smile. "Grief reveals little, Mr. Harcourt, but shock sometimes reveals a great deal." Lionel's eyes narrowed, fractionally and quickly masked. "If you insist." When he had gone, Alleyn turned once more to the steps. He knelt, lowering his face close to the stone. There, a faint discoloration, a smear. Not dirt, not moss. Something else. He touched it with a gloved finger, examined it in the low light. Fog thickened again, swallowing the terrace into a blurred, muted world. Alleyn stood, his expression unreadable. A fall, yes. But the stone told a different story. He turned back toward the drawing room, where polite society waited, contained, courteous, and no doubt, quietly unraveling. The drawing room, when Alleyn returned, had been arranged with the quiet efficiency of a household accustomed to order under stress. Chairs were positioned in small clusters. The fire, banked higher, cast a golden glow upon polished wood and worn rugs. Lady Honoria presided near the hearth, her hands folded upon her lap, eyes dark and watchful, her poise the very image of restraint. Alleyn allowed himself a moment to take in the assembly. Lorimer had settled near the window, his fingers drumming faintly on the armrest. Portia Vale had positioned herself beside him, her gloved hands clasped like a gesture of alliance, her eyes attentive, flicking from one guest to another. Beatrice Darkling leaned against the mantelpiece, her posture casual, though her gaze held a wary alertness. Colonel Pembroke sat rigid as ever, a book resting unopened in his lap. And Lionel Harcourt? Alleyn's glance lingered on him briefly, noting the quiet tension beneath the calm exterior, the faint flare of impatience around his mouth. "Thank you all for remaining," Alleyn began, his voice composed, courteous, a subtle authority underlying its smooth cadence. "I wish merely to ask a few questions, nothing more, in order to understand the events of this evening. I trust we may speak freely, yet without alarm." Each guest inclined politely. None, however, volunteered. That was as it should be. Alleyn had long since learned that in society of this sort, the truth was rarely offered. It was observed. "Miss Vale," he said, turning toward the playwright, "you were recounting a theatrical anecdote during supper. Did you notice anything unusual in Mrs. Harcourt's manner?" Portia paused, pursing her lips. Unusual? She was quiet, yes, more thoughtful than usual, perhaps. She seemed preoccupied, but I attributed it to the fog and the hour. Her voice carried the slightest inflection of defensiveness. "One cannot always attend to every guest's inner state." Alleyn inclined his head. "Of course. And you, Mr. Lorimer, you spoke with her after the music. Anything amiss?" Lorimer's lips pressed into a line. "Merely the same pale fatigue one finds in anyone seated at a concert piano for an hour. I noticed nothing otherwise." He spoke with the measured caution of a man conscious of both propriety and reputation. Alleyn noted it, but made no comment. "Colonel Pembroke, perhaps you saw her on the terrace or passing through the hall?" Alleyn's gaze, gentle yet unyielding, rested on the stiff military figure. Pembroke adjusted the lapels of his jacket, a habitual gesture. "I cannot say. I was occupied in the study with Lady Honoria's catalogue of historical references. I observed her last at supper, and she appeared composed." Alleyn's eyes shifted, ever so slightly, toward Beatrice Darkling. She met his glance directly, almost defiantly. "Miss Darkling, you arrived toward the end of the evening. Did you notice Mrs. Harcourt leave the drawing-room?" Beatrice hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I was speaking with Lady Honoria about the exhibition catalogue. I did not see her depart." Alleyn made a note of the slight hesitation in her tone. The tiniest hesitation, but enough to suggest a distraction, a withheld thought. "Mr. Harcourt," he said finally, turning to the husband, "you were the last to speak with her indoors. Might you describe your conversation?" Lionel's eyes flickered, brief and controlled. "Brief. We discussed the fog, the inconvenience of trains, and the evening itself. Nothing more." His tone was polished, courteous, but there was an edge beneath it, a subtle insistence on precision. Alleyn observed him carefully. "And her mood?" "Calm," Lionel said after a beat. "Composed. I can think of nothing untoward." Alleyn's expression remained impassive. "Thank you. Your accounts are noted." He allowed a pause, letting the weight of unspoken observation settle upon the room. Politeness in such company was a thin veil, and he could feel the tiny tremors beneath it. A glance held too long, a hand clenched just briefly, a throat cleared when no comment had been expected. Each gesture, though small, spoke of inner currents that words might never capture. Lady Honoria inclined her head. "Shall I fetch the footman who discovered her, Inspector?" "Not yet," Alleyn said. "I prefer to continue quietly with the company. Often the most telling evidence lies not in what is said, but what is withheld." A faint rustle of movement echoed from the fireplace, a foot brushing against a rug, and Alleyn noted it all. The room's composure remained unbroken, yet beneath the polished civility, a subtle tension was accumulating, like frost creeping silently over a window pane. In this world, Alleyn knew, nothing screamed, and yet every eye, every gesture, every carefully measured word might carry the key to a mystery whose depth only the night would reveal. Alleyn had long understood that in houses like Renford Hall, the true narrative of events often resided in the subtle attentions of those whose work demanded invisibility. He turned his measured gaze toward the assembled household staff, standing at discreet distance in their muted livery, hands folded, eyes careful not to intrude, yet betraying the faintest tremor of awareness. The butler, Mr. Feltham, was a tall, austere man whose loyalty seemed to include the silent protection of family secrets, while Mrs. Dawlish, the housekeeper, carried the same imperceptible authority among the servants that Lady Honoria exercised upstairs. "Mr. Feltham," Alleyn began, his tone soft, unobtrusive, "would you mind describing precisely what occurred when Mrs. Harcourt left the drawing-room?" The butler straightened, his face an impassive mask, though the tiniest flicker of hesitation passed over his features. I merely observed her move toward the window, sir. She lingered there for a moment, then the footman discovered her on the terrace." Alleyn's eyes were calm, almost disarming. "And you, Mrs. Dawlish? Any observation you might care to share?" She inclined her head slightly, her voice smooth but measured. "Nothing beyond what Mr. Feltham has stated, Inspector. The night was foggy, and Mrs. Harcourt left quietly. She was delicate this evening, as often after performances or social exertions." Alleyn made no reply. He noted the choice of words. Delicate. A polite euphemism, perhaps, or the housekeeper's genuine assessment. But careful. Both Mr. Feltham and Mrs. Dawlish avoided the slightest suggestion that they had seen more than they would admit. And Alleyn, who had spent decades reading the invisible currents in drawing rooms, understood that they had indeed seen more. "Was anyone following her?" Alleyn asked lightly, almost casually, as if speaking of an idle curiosity. "No, sir," Feltham said promptly. "Not that I observed." Mrs. Dawlish, however, lingered a moment longer with her eyes on the floor, her lips pressed tightly together before she said, "But the master, sir." She stopped, caught by a glance from Feltham, and fell silent again. Alleyn did not press. He let the silence linger, knowing the weight of suggestion often revealed more than repeated questioning. The servants had been careful. They had preserved the household's composure, and yet, in their restraint, they had inadvertently disclosed the contours of the evening. That Lionel Harcourt had been present, attentive, perhaps even decisive. That something or someone had been noticed, but carefully ignored in order to maintain appearances. A faint creak from the floorboards indicated movement behind him. Alleyn turned slightly to see a footman, young, nervous, standing with a tray in his hands, the very picture of observant caution. "Did you see anything, Thomas?" Alleyn asked softly, employing the first name as a gentle device of familiarity. The boy's lips parted, then closed, a shallow breath trembling in his chest. I thought I saw, but it may have been the fog, sir." "Thought you saw what?" Alleyn prompted, his voice barely louder than a whisper. The footman swallowed, his hands curling around the tray. "Mrs. Harcourt, she seemed to hesitate, as though waiting for someone." Alleyn inclined his head, allowing the remark to float without comment. It was all he needed to hear. The hesitation, the waiting, the subtle interruption of what should have been a simple walk to the terrace. They were the soft indicators of tension in a night otherwise dominated by decorum. He did not press Thomas further. The boy's nervous revelation had already yielded a useful fragment. Turning back to the room, Alleyn observed the servants once more. They were models of discretion, trained to vanish into the background, yet their very restraint had whispered truths. He filed away each gesture, each careful avoidance, as pieces of a larger, slowly emerging pattern. Later, when he would reconstruct the movements of the household, these hints, delicate, almost invisible, would form the outlines of the night's quiet drama. For now, Alleyn merely noted that the servants, though silent, had not failed to notice. In this house, as in many of its kind, loyalty and discretion were intertwined with knowledge, and knowledge, as always, was power. Alleyn's eyes lingered on Feltham for a final moment. The butler returned his gaze evenly, but there was no mistaking the faintest tightening of the jaw. The truth, Alleyn knew, was there. It simply waited to be coaxed from shadow into light. Alleyn spent the remainder of the evening moving quietly among the rooms of Renford Hall, observing the remnants of the household's evening routines. There was a subtle rhythm to the motions of those who remained awake, a ritual of civility that often disguised the turbulence beneath. Lady Honoria sat in her familiar chair by the fire, her knitting needles resting idly in her lap, a practice she never abandoned, even when the household was in distress. Portia Vale sipped from a delicate china cup, careful not to disturb the placement of the silver teaspoon. Lorimer paced once or twice near the window before returning to the armchair where he now seemed to ponder the night's events in private. Beatrice Darkling remained near the mantel, eyes sweeping the room as though measuring its architecture for some unseen score. Alleyn allowed himself a small, unobtrusive observation of each figure, noting what was said and, perhaps more importantly, what was deliberately unsaid. Yet even amid this carefully maintained calm, there was one anomaly that drew his attention, a detail so subtle that it might have escaped any observer less attuned to the invisible patterns of life in these houses. It was in the music room that he found it. A single sheet of music, half slid beneath the piano bench. Alleyn bent slightly and retrieved it. The piece itself was familiar. Cressida Harcourt had been practicing it earlier in the evening, but here, among the familiar notes, was a small irregularity. A single phrase had been marked with a penciled notation, unusually firm and deliberate, as though the performer intended to draw attention to that moment, to emphasize a particular beat. The marking was slightly smudged, as if someone had erased it in haste, then retraced it incompletely. Alleyn held the sheet carefully, noting the minor dissonance that might have been accidental to anyone else, but was significant to someone trained in observation. It was the sort of imperfection that suggested a routine interrupted, a gesture out of place. And if one considered the evening's sequence, it hinted at something more. A precise action, perhaps, timed to coincide with a moment of distraction or absence. He returned the sheet to its approximate position beneath the piano bench, his gloved fingers lingering over the smudge. The gesture was minute, almost ceremonial, but Alleyn sensed its import. It was, as he often found, not the overt evidence that solved cases, but the subtler deviations from routine that betrayed intention. Alleyn walked slowly back into the drawing room. The guests had shifted again. Lionel Harcourt had removed his jacket, folding it carefully over the back of a chair, but the movements were measured, restrained, deliberate. His hands, when not folded behind his back, were folded on his lap with a quiet rigidity that betrayed the faintest tension. Alleyn's gaze lingered upon him. "You were accustomed to music, I understand," Alleyn said gently, addressing Cressida's husband indirectly. "Do you often mark phrases, guide interpretations, or otherwise engage with a score?" "Occasionally," Lionel admitted, voice neutral. "But I am not a professional. Only attentive to detail, perhaps." Alleyn allowed a faint smile to touch his lips, though his eyes remained observant. Detail, he knew, could be weapon or witness. Beatrice Darkling, noticing the inspector's attention, stirred slightly. Her fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. Alleyn did not comment. In this room, subtle shifts in behavior spoke as loudly as words. She had entered this space with a casual grace, yet now she was taught with something unspoken, an awareness of the invisible narrative threading through the house. Even the footman's movements carried meaning. One placed a tray down with exaggerated care, then withdrew, his eyes flicking to the fireplace and back again. A minor ritual, performed as if rehearsed in anticipation of scrutiny. Alleyn catalogued each detail quietly. By the time he returned to the terrace, fog heavy upon the lawns and terraces, he allowed himself a small, deliberate thought. The smallest divergences from habit often revealed the hidden currents. A penciled mark on a sheet, a hesitation before stepping out, a gesture repeated in measured form, all these could coalesce into a map of intent. The terrace was empty now, save for the faint traces of mist and dew upon the stones. The fog swirled, and Alleyn paused at the balustrade, noting the continuity of shadows, the perfect silence that blanketed the night. A subtle pattern was emerging, though its meaning was not yet clear. It would require patience, observation, and a gentle sifting of motives. The quiet of the house, Alleyn reflected, had begun to speak, and in the smallest interruption of routine, the smudge of pencil, the hesitation, the measured step, he had found a clue. The mystery, he understood, would unravel not in grand declarations, but in the silence of small, deliberate gestures. The hours of the night stretched forward with a quiet deliberation. In Renford Hall, the household seemed suspended between the insistence of routine and the subtle tremor of unease. Alleyn, seated near the fire, with the soft glow illuminating the planes of his face, allowed his mind to drift along the slender threads of observation he had gathered. The hesitation of hands, the carefully measured distance between gazes, the faint irregularity on the sheet of music. Each anomaly was a whisper, and he listened intently. It was Beatrice Darkling who first introduced a new disturbance. She rose from her seat with the decorum of someone attending a rehearsal rather than a drawing-room gathering, and approached Lady Honoria, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I hope you will forgive me," she murmured, "but I believe I may have seen something earlier, something concerning." Lady Honoria's knitting needles paused, mid-air. "Something concerning, Miss Darkling." "Yes," Beatrice said, glancing briefly toward the terrace doors, as though the fog beyond might swallow the confession. "A note, perhaps, or a folded paper. I thought it dropped from Cressida's hand, or perhaps from the piano. I cannot be certain. It vanished before I could retrieve it." Alleyn's eyes, calm yet incisive, turned toward her. "And you observed this when, precisely?" "During the music," she said. "While she played. I did not wish to interfere. Merely noticed a movement." The room fell silent, the guests exchanging discreet glances, some masking curiosity with polite interest, others revealing it in the faint furrow of a brow. Lionel Harcourt, seated nearest to the fireplace, did not move. His hands rested lightly upon his knees, expression composed but unreadable. Alleyn nodded slowly. "Thank you, Miss Darkling. You did the right thing by mentioning it." He allowed a pause, letting the weight of her observation settle without comment. Notes, gestures, and papers were often the carriers of intent. Something had shifted that evening. Small, almost imperceptible, yet now rendered visible by her remark. As Beatrice returned to her place near the mantel, a faint commotion arose in the doorway. The footman, Thomas, returned from a hurried trip to the terrace and whispered something to Mr. Feltham. The butler nodded, his expression unchanged, but with a subtle tightening of the jaw. Alleyn caught the movement, as one might notice a shadow out of the corner of the eye, and his thoughts began to align along a new axis of suspicion. "There appears," Alleyn said quietly, "to have been more than one departure from routine tonight. A note, perhaps a hesitation, perhaps a gesture unnoticed by others. And, as is often the case, it is these tiny divergences which suggest that the equilibrium of the evening was altered deliberately." Portia Vale stirred, glancing at him with a slight lift of the eyebrow. "Do you think it deliberate?" she asked, carefully neutral. "It is too early to assert definitively," Alleyn replied, his tone even, measured, yet carrying an undercurrent of persuasion. "But the fact that a small object, something as inconsequential as a note, can vanish quietly while everyone else is preoccupied, does suggest intention. And intention," he added softly, is often the invisible hand behind events which appear accidental. A faint sound then drew his attention, a low, intermittent cough. Lionel Harcourt rose abruptly, excusing himself, and moved toward the corridor with a precision that spoke of rehearsed control. Alleyn noted the departure, the deliberate angle of the shoulder, the absence of any genuine alarm. Something unspoken hovered in that gesture, an invisible pulse of tension that the fog and the night had hitherto concealed. By the time the corridor doors had closed behind him, Lady Honoria sighed, her shoulders easing fractionally. "I had hoped," she murmured, "that nothing more would disturb the household. This night has been relentless." Alleyn inclined his head slightly, eyes sweeping the room. "Indeed, yet the patterns we observe, Lady Honoria, are not without meaning. One must attend to the small disturbances, the fleeting hesitations, for they often contain the larger truth." The drawing-room fell back into its careful hush. Candles flickered, shadows shifted, and the mist outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. Alleyn returned to his seat near the fire, hands folded. Within the measured calm, however, a tension had arisen that would not be ignored. A second, subtle stir had occurred in the household, a note lost or dropped, a whispered hesitation, a controlled exit. It was a quiet collapse in decorum, almost imperceptible, yet sufficient to reveal the edges of human intention beneath the elegant mask of civility. Alleyn sensed that the night had yet to yield its full story, and he, as always, would watch and wait, letting the silences speak in place of cries. By the early hours of the morning, the house had surrendered most of its outward tension to a fragile calm. The fog, heavier now, pressed like a damp veil against the tall windows of Renford Hall, muting even the faintest stir of the distant fields. Alleyn remained in the drawing-room, seated near the fire, the warmth hardly touching the cool precision of his mind. He had observed the household at its most polished and at its most uneasy, tracing the subtle dissonances of gestures, hesitations, and silences. In the quiet, he reviewed each fragment: Cressida's faint pallor before supper, the slight irregularity on the music sheet, Beatrice's glimpse of a vanishing note, the precise, controlled exit of Lionel Harcourt, and the hushed, almost imperceptible signals from the servants. Each fragment alone might have seemed trivial. Together, however, they began to form the outlines of an invisible architecture, delicate yet deliberate. Alleyn leaned back, his fingers steepled before him, eyes narrowing in contemplation. The mind, he often reflected, was an instrument more subtle than any evidence collected in the field. Objects could mislead, footprints might lie, but the human spirit, under pressure, betrayed itself in ways far more telling. He considered Lionel Harcourt, a composed man, undeniably, but one who displayed the slightest tremor when the conversation turned toward the terrace, toward the evening's interruptions. The hands, the measured movements, the careful avoidance of casual glance toward Beatrice Darkling, all spoke of self-restraint maintained only through conscious effort. There was something he wished to hide, a truth he could not permit to surface casually. Beatrice herself was a more complicated study. Her defiance, though quiet, suggested both fear and awareness. The mention of the dropped note, a detail so minor that most would have dismissed it, was, to Alleyn's mind, a deliberate disclosure. Yet she feared, or perhaps respected, the power of the household's hierarchy, and so chose timing and phrasing with meticulous care. The servants, too, contributed their own pattern of truth. Mr. Feltham and Mrs. Dawlish had observed far more than they admitted. The young footman's nervous hesitation revealed that even within the most disciplined ranks of the household, knowledge moved cautiously, weighed against loyalty and discretion. It was a living lattice of perception and silence, the kind that could reveal intention if one only waited long enough to read it. Alleyn rose and moved toward the terrace doors. The mist pressed against the glass, and the stones below glistened faintly with dew. He considered the trajectory of Cressida's last moments. A hesitation, a step out into fog, an object lost or dropped, the absence of struggle, the quiet inevitability of her fall. Nothing was theatrical. Nothing screamed for attention. Yet the pattern of behavior suggested careful orchestration, subtle enough that only a trained observer could perceive its outline. Returning to the fire, Alleyn allowed himself a faint smile, imperceptible to the others. In this house, as in so many he had entered over the years, the truth resided not in the grand gesture, but in the quiet fractures of routine, the imperceptible deviations from habit, the almost invisible pressures exerted upon people whose lives were measured in propriety. Alleyn noted the psychology beneath the calm. Fear, deference, guilt, and pride, these were the forces that guided the evening. Each guest had maintained composure, yet each had revealed in the smallest of gestures a thread of truth. Lionel's careful movements suggested concealment. Beatrice's measured confession suggested caution. The servant's silence suggested both knowledge and fear. Even Lady Honoria's knitting, serene as it appeared, betrayed a heartbeat of tension in the subtle clenching of her needles. He returned briefly to the music room, considering again the smudged marking on Cressida's sheet. It was a minor detail, perhaps imperceptible to anyone else, but it hinted at disruption, a pause in routine and possibly a timed intention. Alleyn's intuition, cultivated over years of subtle observation, settled upon the conclusion that Cressida's fall, though appearing accidental, had been influenced by forces she neither anticipated nor controlled. Alleyn exhaled slowly, allowing his thoughts to gather like dust settling in the corners of a room. The evening had offered no outbursts, no cries, no spectacular evidence. Yet in the hush, in the careful choreography of gestures and glances, the truth had begun to whisper itself. And Alleyn, as always, had listened. He returned to the drawing room, stepping lightly across the carpet. The household remained quiet, suspended between awareness and fatigue, the fog pressing against the windows like a witness. Alleyn's gaze swept over each face, seeing beyond the polite expressions to the subtle tensions beneath. The path of revelation would be gentle, deliberate, and inescapable. And in that quiet, he sensed that the final movements of the night's story were only just beginning to unfold. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the fog-laden windows of Renford Hall, softening the edges of the drawing room and lending an almost ethereal calm to its polished surfaces. Alleyn, seated in his customary chair near the hearth, allowed the quiet to stretch, absorbing the subtle rhythms of the household. The guests had retired, some to private rooms, some lingering in corridors with the hushed murmurs of restless sleep. Yet the silence held a tension that would not dissipate with the night's passing. It had accumulated, invisible, but heavy. Alleyn rose and moved to the window, observing the mist curling around the terrace below. The events of the previous evening, the small hesitations, the vanishing note, the measured movements of Lionel Harcourt, had settled into his mind like pieces of a delicate puzzle. It was time, he decided, to confront the one figure whose presence had dominated the night's silent choreography. He found Lionel in the morning room, alone, standing by the table with his back to the window. The man's posture was impeccable, his hands lightly resting on the surface, yet there was a subtle tightness in the shoulders, a barely perceptible shadow beneath the calm veneer. "Inspector," Lionel said without turning, his tone composed, yet carrying the faintest trace of anticipation. "Good morning, Mr. Harcourt," Alleyn replied gently. "May I join you?" "Certainly," Lionel said, moving aside with the fluid courtesy of someone who had been trained to anticipate social expectation even in private moments. Alleyn's gaze was quiet, measured, as he seated himself. "You were careful last night," he began softly. "Careful to maintain composure, careful with glances, careful with movement. A creditable performance under the circumstances. Lionel turned at last, a subtle lift of the brow, though his expression remained composed. "Thank you, Inspector. I do my best." "I am aware," Alleyn said, voice low and calm, "that accidents do occur, yet I also know that not all appearances are what they seem." A hesitation, a note dropped, the smallest deviation from routine. These are often the markers of intention. A faint twitch passed over Lionel's jaw, quickly suppressed. He leaned slightly forward, hands clasped. "You suggest, then, that my wife's fall was not entirely accidental?" Alleyn's gaze met his evenly. "I suggest only that the circumstances merit careful consideration. I've observed behavior throughout the evening that is consistent with someone wishing to conceal knowledge, to manage perception. It is a delicate matter, of course, but the patterns are, if I may say, unusually coherent." Lionel remained silent, his hands flexing minutely on the table. His eyes, however, betrayed a subtle shift, a small acknowledgement that the inspector's words had struck a chord. "I will not shout, nor will I demand confession in this room," Alleyn continued softly. "We are not in the business of theatrics, but I require clarity. Cressida's movements, the vanishing note, the hesitation, these form a sequence that cannot be ignored. Will you explain them to me?" The pause stretched, taut and quiet. Then Lionel spoke, measured, deliberate. "It is true that I was aware of her intentions. Small, innocent intentions, I assure you. But yes, I moved subtly to prevent embarrassment, to protect her from a mistake that might have reflected poorly upon her or upon the house." Alleyn inclined his head slightly, absorbing the explanation. "And the note?" "The note." Lionel's voice faltered just slightly, then steadied. "I realized it might have been misinterpreted. I removed it. A trivial precaution, I thought at the time." Alleyn let the statement hang. The words revealed more than they concealed, and yet the calmness of delivery maintained the facade of civility. He leaned back, allowing the gentle weight of observation to settle. "Very well," he said finally. "It seems we have established a clearer understanding. The night has offered lessons in restraint, discretion, and the delicate balance of appearances. Let us, for the moment, allow the household its calm. There will be time, later, for fuller resolution." Lionel inclined his head, releasing a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding. Alleyn rose and straightened his coat, his eyes sweeping the room one last time. The fog had lifted slightly, the morning light soft but revealing. Outside, the terraces gleamed faintly, a reminder of the night's events. The confrontation had been quiet, precise, and, most importantly, contained. No accusation shouted across the drawing room, no dramatic reveal, only the gentle articulation of truths, subtly extracted and mutually understood. Alleyn's satisfaction lay not in spectacle, but in the revelation achieved through observation, patience, and the quiet unfolding of human behavior. The morning sun, though pale and diffused through lingering fog, cast a quiet clarity across Renford Hall. In the drawing room, the household had gathered again, not with the anticipation of accusation, but with the subdued air of expectation that follows an uncertain night. Alleyn, as ever, seated with composed patience, allowed the stillness to settle over the assembled company before speaking. "Lady Honoria, Miss Vale, Colonel Pembroke, Miss Darkling," he began, his voice calm and measured. "I thank you for your continued cooperation. What transpired last evening is, I believe, now largely understood, though the manner of understanding must be gentle." His eyes swept the room with the faintest glint of that quiet authority which commanded attention without imposing it. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. There was no theatrical flourish, no dramatic interruption. The tension existed only in the pause, in the unspoken comprehension that something decisive was about to be articulated. The movements and actions that evening, when considered together, Alleyn continued, reveal a pattern of intention, subtle yet deliberate. Miss Harcourt's fall, which might have appeared accidental, occurred in circumstances influenced by human intervention. A note misplaced or removed, gestures carefully measured, hesitation at the threshold of the terrace, all these point to an orchestration of quiet precision. A soft intake of breath moved through the room, and Alleyn allowed it to linger. His gaze rested on Lionel Harcourt, whose hands were folded neatly before him, posture unchanged, but eyes no longer entirely impassive. "It was you, Mr. Harcourt," Alleyn said softly, "who sought to manage appearances. Your intention was not malicious in the conventional sense, but it was intervention nonetheless. You sought to prevent a small embarrassment, and in doing so, influence the course of events that led to tragedy." Lionel's voice was quiet, carefully measured, but it trembled ever so slightly. "Yes, I did not anticipate—" "Of course," Alleyn interjected gently. "Your motives were protective, guided by propriety and concern. Yet protection, when misapplied, can have consequences one cannot foresee." Alleyn's attention then shifted, slowly, to Beatrice Darkling. "And you, Miss Darkling, observed an occurrence, minor, seemingly inconsequential, which might have revealed more than intended. Your discretion was commendable, and your restraint exemplary." Beatrice inclined her head, lips pressed in a faint line, her hands folded upon her lap. Her glance toward Lionel was subtle but unmistakable, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared understanding of what had transpired. Portia Vale stirred, glancing at Lady Honoria. "So, nothing criminal then?" she asked softly, curiosity tinged with relief. Alleyn allowed a faint smile to touch his features. "Not in the sense of premeditation, no. But human actions, even those guided by civility, can influence outcomes beyond anticipation. The night's lesson lies in the quiet power of minor gestures and unspoken interventions." Lady Honoria's knitting needles, still poised, trembled ever so slightly. "I see," she murmured. "The night was delicate indeed." Alleyn stood, moving slowly, deliberately, so that every step seemed to honor the measured rhythm of the room. He looked to the servants who had returned now to their quiet stations. "And the household itself," he said, "has preserved dignity, discretion, and loyalty. It is a testament to the subtle understanding of human nature that events of this sort remain contained, even when tragedy intervenes." Lionel Harcourt inclined his head, the faintest flush crossing his cheeks. "I accept the consequences of my intervention, Inspector," he said quietly. "I understand now that intention alone is insufficient to determine outcome." "Precisely," Alleyn replied. "And that is the nature of life in houses such as this. Civility and care, combined with inattention or interference, may yield outcomes unforeseen. It is neither shameful nor villainous, merely human." A silence settled, comfortable and final, punctuated only by the gentle creak of chairs and the whisper of knitting needles. Alleyn allowed it to linger, knowing that in this quiet, in this restrained acknowledgement, the truth had been delivered in its gentlest form. There was no spectacle, no forced confession, only understanding and acceptance, layered with civility. Alleyn turned toward the window where the fog had begun to lift, revealing the terraces and lawns of Renford Hall. Outside, the day held clarity and possibility, yet inside, the lessons of the night remained. That actions, however minor, echo quietly through lives, and that observation, patience, and gentle confrontation reveal what force or violence might not. And in that quiet room, the mystery had been resolved. not with shouting, but with the careful unfolding of human intention and consequence. The day had fully brightened, though the mist still lingered over the lawns of Renford Hall, curling softly around the terraces and hedges like a delicate whisper. Alleyn moved among the guests with his customary measured grace, ensuring that the household understood both the resolution and the gentle limits of consequence. In this world, justice was rarely a matter of dramatic gesture. It was a matter of recognition, of social equilibrium restored, or at least acknowledged. Lionel Harcourt remained seated near the morning-room fireplace, the lines of tension in his face slowly softening. His acceptance of the night's events was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. He understood, as did Alleyn, that his actions, though well-intended, had consequences. And yet there was a subtle irony in the manner of their revelation. It was not legal justice that had been delivered, nor dramatic censure, but the inevitable moral clarity that observation and reflection wrought. Alleyn approached Lady Honoria, who was now seated by the window, knitting needles poised but idle. Her eyes, usually bright with control and authority, carried the faintest shadow of reflection. "The household has been preserved, Inspector," she said quietly. "I think we may breathe at last, though the lessons will remain with us." "Indeed," Alleyn replied. "It is often the case that propriety and human intention are sufficient to correct the course of events, even without formal consequence. The moral weight is applied gently, but invariably." Beatrice Darkling lingered near the mantel, her posture upright, yet relaxed in a subtle manner that suggested relief. Her eyes met Alleyn's briefly, acknowledging a silent understanding. In this world, the observant could discern not only the causes of events, but the nuances of their resolution. Small interventions, carefully managed, could yield correction without conflict. Unspoken acknowledgement could weigh as heavily as judgment. Portia Vale, standing near the foot of the stairs, offered a tentative comment. "So the truth is known, and yet nothing has been lost in terms of dignity?" Alleyn allowed a small, rare smile to touch his lips. "Precisely. In houses such as this, dignity is maintained through observation, discretion, and the acceptance of human imperfection. It is often more instructive than the application of law or punishment. The truth has been revealed, acknowledgement has been made, and, in time, the household will return to its accustomed rhythm, wiser and more cautious than before." Outside, the fog continued to lift, revealing terraces glistening with dew. The quiet inevitability of the morning mirrored the quiet inevitability of human action. Subtle, deliberate, yet inescapable. Alleyn moved toward the central hallway, allowing his eyes to sweep over the architecture of the house, the corridors, the subtle echoes of last night's small disturbances. Each room, each gesture, each unnoticed hesitation had played a part in a narrative that was now complete. "Inspector," Lionel said finally, his voice low and calm, "I appreciate your discretion and understanding. It is reassuring in a way that acknowledgement alone suffices." "Sometimes," Alleyn replied, "the awareness of consequence is a far more precise instrument than any formal sanction. It is subtle, but its effect is enduring. Human behavior, observed and reflected upon, has its own justice." Lady Honoria inclined her head, her knitting needles returning to motion. The rhythmic click of needles filled the otherwise quiet room, a reminder of continuity, of pattern, and of the soft structures that govern society. "Then perhaps," she murmured, "the night has taught us all something about restraint and observation." "Yes," Alleyn said, returning to his chair by the fire, "and that is often all the justice one requires." There was no applause, no dramatic acknowledgement. Only the quiet recognition of inevitability, the subtle weight of moral clarity, and the soft relief that comes when human intention has been laid bare without spectacle. In Renford Hall, the household breathed once more in the still, gentle rhythm of restored order. The small stirrings, the faint hesitations, and the careful gestures of the previous evening had yielded clarity, and in that clarity lay a justice of a kind far subtler, yet more enduring than any tribunal could deliver. Alleyn's eyes lingered on the windows, observing the fog as it drifted away across the lawns. In the hush of morning, in the quiet balance restored, there was both irony and instruction, that human action, even well-intended, could shape events beyond foresight, and that acknowledgement, patience, and discretion were instruments as exacting as any law. The halls of Renford Hall were now suffused with the pale clarity of late morning. Sunlight, filtered through the lingering haze of mist, struck the polished woodwork and crystal surfaces, creating faint patterns that danced across the walls like subdued spectres of the night before. Alleyn lingered near the terrace, his hands lightly clasped behind his back, surveying the grounds as if the fog itself might reveal secrets still hidden. He considered the events that had unfolded, the quiet fall of Cressida Harcourt, the small disturbances of a note, a hesitation, a gesture, the subtle orchestration by Lionel Harcourt intended to protect rather than harm, and the observant restraint of the household, whose silence had both concealed and revealed truth. In the gentle unfolding of these events, Alleyn saw, as he often did, the delicate machinery of human behavior, intentions that, though well-meaning, carried consequences beyond anticipation, and the quiet moral balances that existed within elegant restraint. He recalled Beatrice Darkling's discreet disclosure of the vanishing note, and the young footman's nervously withheld observation. In such a house, the servants often held the threads of the narrative, a lattice of subtle knowledge that the wealthy and cultured might overlook. Knowledge, Alleyn reflected, was not only power, it was responsibility. And in this house, that responsibility had been exercised with careful discretion, preserving both dignity and the possibility of understanding. Alleyn turned his gaze toward Lionel, who was walking slowly across the terrace, seemingly at ease yet carrying the invisible weight of recognition. The man had not committed a crime in the conventional sense, yet his actions had influenced the course of events. Justice, in its formal sense, was unnecessary. Moral clarity and acknowledgement sufficed. The quiet acceptance of consequence, combined with the awareness of human fallibility, was often a more enduring resolution than any tribunal or sentence could impose. Lady Honoria appeared at the terrace doors, knitting needles poised but resting. Her eyes, bright and discerning, met Alleyn's briefly. He offered a faint nod, one that conveyed both reassurance and recognition of her steadiness throughout the ordeal. Civility, Alleyn reflected, was itself a form of insight. It preserved order, facilitated understanding, and revealed the subtleties of character in ways that spectacle could never achieve. Alleyn allowed himself a moment of observation. The gardens, still glistening with dew, were quiet. A solitary bird flitted along the terrace, leaving a faint shadow in its wake. In the absence of dramatic declaration, the truth lay in the smallest details. The gentle shift of expression, the careful placement of hands, the almost imperceptible acknowledgement of responsibility. The night's mystery had unfolded, not in confrontation or alarm, but in the silent accord of perception and reflection. He recalled the smudged marking on Cressida's music sheet, the tiny deviation that had indicated a moment of hesitation, a pause in routine that had guided the night's sequence. Alleyn had known then as now that the subtleties of human intention were often concealed in the smallest acts, and that the patient observer might read the invisible script of behavior with far greater precision than any outward evidence. The household had returned to its pattern, each individual resuming the rhythms of etiquette and routine. Yet Alleyn understood that beneath that continuity, a new awareness had taken root. Human action, however polite or restrained, bore weight. Decisions, no matter how subtle, had consequences. And in this house, the acknowledgement of those consequences had sufficed to restore balance. Alleyn stepped closer to the window, watching the mist lift across the lawns. The morning carried with it a quiet inevitability that the world would continue, shaped by intention and perception alike, and that understanding, gentle, measured, unobtrusive, was sometimes the truest form of justice. He turned briefly to observe the servants who moved quietly, unobtrusive and vigilant, maintaining the invisible lattice of order. In their discretion lay the preservation of the household's dignity, a testament to the subtle power of human awareness. Alleyn allowed himself a faint, approving thought. The household had survived the night's disturbances, not by law nor by force, but by attention, restraint, and the delicate interplay of observation and acknowledgement. As he finally stepped back from the terrace, the sunlight now spreading across the gardens, Alleyn's mind settled. There would be no grand celebration of revelation, no dramatic conclusion. Instead, there would be reflection, quiet understanding, and the knowledge that the events of the night had left an enduring mark upon each participant, subtle but unshakable. And as the house resumed its rhythm, the detective's last thought, lingering in the soft morning light, was simple yet profound. Human intention, however small, leaves traces, sometimes visible, sometimes imperceptible, but always capable of shaping the course of lives. In that understanding, Alleyn found both resolution and the faint, poetic solace of observation fulfilled.